They called me a beggar. Right there in the middle of the market, while the air still smelled of oranges just cut open, while the fishmonger was shouting his morning prices, while the bread cart rolled in with its crackling loaves. My neighbor hissed the words, sharp as vinegar. "You look like a beggar in that old coat." I had known her for 40 years, known the shape of her voice through the walls when she fought with her husband, known the way she borrowed sugar on Thursdays and flour on Sundays, known the false little laugh she used when trying to soften cruelty. And yet she said it, in a tone that invited the others around to hear. I smiled back, not because I wasn't wounded, but because I have survived wounds deeper than her tongue. I smiled and answered, "And yet you beg me for sugar every week." The market went on, clattering around us, but inside me, something shifted. I am 76 years old. I live in a small flat above a bakery that smells of yeast at dawn and grease at night. The walls are thin, the pipes moan when I run water, and the stairwell smells of damp stone. I live alone, but not in silence. Memory speaks louder than company sometimes. That coat she mocked has been with me since the winter of 1984, when my husband was laid off and we had to decide between heating oil and a new crib for our youngest. I bought the crib. A neighbor, not the one who mocked me today, but another woman long gone, pressed that wool coat into my hands, saying, "It's not new, but it's warm, and you have children to keep alive." I wore it on icy mornings when I stood in bread lines, on evenings when I carried laundry through snow, on nights when I searched for lost coins in sofa cushions to pay the bus fare to my night shift. That coat has known more about survival than my neighbor ever will. To her, it is just old cloth, frayed seams, a reminder of poverty she pretends never touched her. To me, it is witness. It carries the weight of every year I endured without collapsing. And yet, standing in the market, I felt all eyes sliding toward me, not to see the history woven into the fabric, but to judge the wear, the tired color, the way the sleeves had thinned. I knew in that moment that no one in that circle saw me as a woman with a name, a past, a dignity. They saw only the surface, and the surface had grown too shabby for their liking. I have lived long enough to know that humiliation is rarely sudden. It creeps in like damp under a door, softening the wood until one day the frame crumbles. Her words were only the strike that revealed the rot had already been spreading. In the way the butcher now offers me the bruised apples first, in the way children at the bus stop smirk when I shuffle past, in the way clerks at the pharmacy speak. Louder, as if age has made me deaf rather than weary. I felt the market's noise fade, the cries of vendors become distant, and inside me something cold and sharp formed. I thought of all the times that same woman knocked at my door, apologetic and smiling, asking if she could borrow a cup of sugar, a spoon of coffee, sometimes even a few slices of bread. I gave without hesitation, because that is what neighbors do, or at least what I was taught neighbors do. I never kept count, but the body remembers generosity the way it remembers bruises, each small act layering until it becomes weight. And so when she called me a beggar, I thought of her hands stretched out in my kitchen week after week, and I knew who had really been begging all these years. Still, I walked home with my groceries tucked close to me, my chin held low, because defiance is one thing, but shame is another, and both can live in the same chest. My feet ached. My heart ached more. At home, I hung the coat on its usual hook, ran my hand over the fabric, and felt a trembling that was not just from age. I am not naive. I know what it means to be old in a world that worships youth, to be poor in a neighborhood that suddenly pretends it has always been wealthy, to be alone in a culture that values women only when they are needed as mothers or wives. But knowing does not make it easier. It only makes the insult land more cleanly, like a knife on skin that has been cut before in the same place. I boiled water for tea, though the taste was metallic because the pipes are old, and I sat at my table remembering. Memory is not kind when it arrives with the scent of humiliation still in your nose. It drags you back to other markets, other words, other times you were made small. I remembered being 20 and wearing shoes so thin I had to stuff cardboard inside them to keep the water out. Remembered the whispers of my husband's relatives who said he had married beneath him. Remembered my son's embarrassed tone when he once asked me not to walk too close to his friends because my clothes looked old-fashioned. Each insult accumulates like dust on the shelves, until one day you cannot ignore the thickness of it. That day in the market was not the beginning. It was only the latest entry in a long ledger of erasures. I sat there in my flat, steam curling from the chipped mug, and I thought, so this is what I have become to them. A figure of pity, a scarecrow in wool, a convenient target for small cruelties. But inside, I felt another thought rising, one I had not allowed in years. What if I do not accept this role anymore? What if I let them choke on their own disdain instead of swallowing it for them? It startled me, that thought, because for decades my survival has depended on silence, on endurance, on carrying my burdens without complaint. But humiliation can be fertile soil for change. Something in me, brittle but unbroken, whispered that maybe, just maybe, I could still choose how to be seen. And so I tell you this, not because I want pity, but because stories like mine are buried too easily. They are buried under gossip at markets, under polite dismissals at family dinners, under the casual cruelty of neighbors who borrow without gratitude. I am 76. I wear a coat older than some marriages. I live alone above a bakery. And yes, my neighbor called me a beggar. But I am here, still breathing, still remembering, still deciding what parts of myself I refuse to surrender. That is where my story begins. It would have been easy to dismiss her words as just another neighbor's cruelty, another passing insult from a woman who has always used her tongue like a weapon. But something about the way she said it that morning in the market cut deeper than the usual gossip because she wanted witnesses. She wanted me diminished in the eyes of others. And for the first time in many years, I felt the ground under me tilt, as if all the small indignities that had accumulated over decades suddenly aligned themselves in one sharp point that pierced clean through. When I returned home, carrying the bruised apples I had chosen because they were cheaper, and the bread that had already gone stale on the shelf, I set the bags down on my table, and for a long while simply sat, not moving, not even removing the coat. From my shoulders, letting its weight press against me like a reminder that I was still anchored here, still visible even if what they saw was something diminished. The words kept echoing in my head, not because I believed them, but because they tapped into an old fear that perhaps everyone around me had already silently decided the same thing and were only waiting for someone bold enough to speak it aloud. I stared at my kitchen wall, at the little calendar with its printed saints and its boxes I rarely filled anymore, and I thought about how easily a person can be reduced, how quickly a lifetime of work, sacrifice, and quiet resilience can be erased by a single sentence whispered in the wrong place. I remembered that this was not the first time someone had spoken to me like that. Years ago, when my husband lost his job and I picked up extra cleaning work to keep food on the table, a cousin of his told me at a family dinner that I smelled like bleach and worry and should have let the government take care of us instead of embarrassing the family with my scrubbing. I had laughed it off then, though inside I wanted to scream, because at least then I was still useful, still fighting for our survival. But now, decades later, with my children grown and my husband buried, there was no scrubbing to prove my worth, no labor to justify my presence. There was only me and an old coat, and a neighbor who had decided that was enough evidence to brand me a beggar. What hurt most was not her words, but the silence that followed them. No one at the market spoke up. No one said, "Leave her be," or reminded her how often she had knocked at my door for sugar or coffee, how many times I had stood beside her in winter, handing over what little I had. They looked at me, some with discomfort, some with amusement, but none with recognition. That silence was the true betrayal, because it told me that in their eyes I was already small enough to be dismissed, and perhaps they had been waiting for this moment all along. Later that evening, as the sun fell behind the narrow street and the bakery below me closed its shutters, I opened the cupboard where I keep the old ledger of my household accounts. It is a habit I cannot break, though money has been scarce for years. I still record every coin spent on bread, every bill paid late, every small debt repaid. My neighbor's name appears there too, not in money, but in flour and sugar and teaspoons of coffee. I had never thought to keep track until one day, long ago, I began writing her name in the margins whenever she borrowed something, not out of resentment, but to remind myself she had come, she had needed me, she had relied on me. Now I turned the pages and read them slowly, line after line, realizing that what I had once seen as harmless generosity had accumulated into a history of quiet giving. And yet here she was, calling me a beggar, while I had been the one she leaned on all along. It was then, holding that old ledger, that I understood the real wound was not just her insult, but the revelation that I had allowed myself to become invisible. By giving without asking, by enduring without complaint, by shrinking myself so that others might grow, I had created the conditions for this humiliation. The betrayal was not only hers, it was mine too, because I had betrayed myself each time I stayed silent when someone diminished me. The realization was sharp and bitter, but it was also strangely clarifying, like the moment when a storm breaks and you finally see the damage that has been done to your roof. I poured myself tea that tasted of metal and dust, sat by the window, and watched the street empty of people. I thought of my children, who rarely call, who live in houses where my photograph is not on display, who send me birthday cards late, if at all. I thought of the years I spent being useful, being the one who filled in the cracks, who mended socks and paid bills and carried other people's burdens without demanding thanks. And I thought of how easily, now that I am old and my usefulness to them has diminished, I have been allowed to slip into the role of the pitied, the overlooked, the one mocked in public. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in my narrow bed, the ceiling creaking above me with the footsteps of tenants I do not know, and I felt the weight of every year pressing down. But beneath that weight, another feeling stirred, small but insistent, like a seed pressing against soil, the knowledge that something had to change. The insult in the market was not just cruelty, it was a catalyst, a line drawn that I could not step back from. To do nothing now would be to accept their judgment, to agree that I am nothing more than what they see in a frayed coat. I could not allow that. I would not allow that. So in the darkness, with the city hushed and the air cold against the window glass, I made a decision, though I did not yet know what form it would take. I decided that I would not be the neighbor's beggar, nor the market's object of pity, nor the family's afterthought. I decided that whatever strength remained in me, however little it seemed compared to what I once had, I would use it to reclaim some piece of myself. The insult was her gift to me, though she did not mean it so. It showed me where I stood in the eyes of others, and in that mirror, I found the courage to ask where I wished to stand for myself. And that, more than the coat, more than the market, more than the silence of bystanders, was the true betrayal and the true beginning. For the first time in many years, I was no longer only enduring. I was preparing to act. In the days that followed, the insult from the market did not fade as quickly as I had hoped. It lingered like smoke clinging to clothes long after the fire has gone out, seeping into every errand I ran and every silence in my small apartment. And what surprised me most was not the sharpness of the wound, but the way the world around me seemed to adjust itself to confirm what had been spoken aloud. When I walked back to the market the next week, I felt eyes slide over me with a new weight, as if some invisible verdict had been passed and everyone was waiting to see if I would crumble under it. The butcher, who once greeted me with a nod of respect, now pressed the smaller cut of meat into my hands before I even asked, saying with a smile that it was better suited to my appetite, though I knew he meant my purse, and the woman at the vegetable stall offered me the bruised peaches first, her voice too sweet to be genuine, while behind me a younger woman whispered to her friend, and both glanced at me quickly before looking away. Nothing was said outright. No one dared to hiss Beggar again, but the air was heavy with the knowledge that someone already had, and now it was easier for the rest to believe it. I tried to carry myself as if I had not heard, to keep my back straight and my gaze steady, but even my own body seemed to conspire against me, my legs aching more quickly than usual, my shoulders stooping no matter how I willed them upright, my hands trembling when I counted out coins at the bread cart. It is a cruel trick of age that the very signs of resilience, lines etched deep from years of endurance, joints stiffened from decades of labor, become misread as weakness, as decline, as evidence that you are what they say you are. I began to walk faster through the market, keeping my eyes down, not because I agreed with their judgment, but because I could not bear the thought of catching another smirk or overhearing another whisper. And in doing so, I realized I was already conceding ground, already shrinking myself so they would have less to attack. That is how humiliation works. It does not end with the insult. It keeps feeding on the silence that follows. At home, the coat hung heavier on its hook than ever before. I touched it with mixed feelings, part reverence for all it had carried me through, part shame for how it now marked me in the eyes of others. I tried to convince myself that the shame was theirs, not mine. But the distinction blurred when I caught my own reflection in the window and thought, perhaps they are right. Perhaps I do look like a beggar. Perhaps I have carried this relic too long. The thought terrified me, not because of vanity, but because it meant I was beginning to accept their definition of me. And once you accept that, you are lost. I busied myself with small tasks, mending an old pillowcase, reordering the tins in the cupboard, sweeping the floor though it did not need it, anything to keep from sitting still long enough for the echo of her words to take root deeper. But even in the silence of my rooms, reminders crept in. The landlord left a note about raising the rent, written in polite but impersonal handwriting, as if to remind me that my place in this building, too, was precarious. My children's absence was louder than usual that week. No calls, no letters, nothing but the occasional advertisement addressed to me in the mailbox. It was as though the entire world had conspired to emphasize what the neighbor had said. You are not valuable. You are only tolerated at best, pitied at worst. One evening, I sat with the ledger again, the one where I had begun to record every borrowed cup of sugar, every spoon of coffee, every small kindness that my neighbor had taken. At first I told myself I looked through it for comfort, proof that I had given more than I had taken, that I was not the beggar in this story. But as I turned the pages, a new feeling emerged, quieter but sharper. Resentment. I had always believed generosity was its own reward, that giving without expecting thanks was a kind of grace. But reading her name scrawled there dozens of times, I felt a bitterness rise, because generosity without recognition becomes servitude, and servitude without respect becomes erasure. And I realized that I had been letting myself be erased, one borrowed cup at a time. That night, I dreamed of the market, not as it was, but as it had been years ago, when I was still young enough to carry children on my hip and baskets on my arm, when people greeted me by name, when the vendors smiled at me, not because they pitied me, but because they remembered the jokes my husband used to tell, the songs I used to hum while choosing fruit. I woke with tears on my cheeks, not for the insult itself, but for the loss of that woman, the one I used to be. She had not vanished all at once. She had been worn away, thinned out like the sleeves of my coat, until only a husk remained for others to dismiss. In the mornings that followed, I found myself hesitating before putting on the coat, running my hands along its seams, wondering whether wearing it was an act of defiance or an act of surrender. Some mornings I told myself it was armor, proof that I had survived harder winters than this, that I carried memory on my back like a shield. Other mornings, I saw it only as evidence of decline, a rag to confirm what they whispered. The truth was probably both, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. Every time I left the apartment, I felt as though I was choosing not just what to wear, but what to be. A woman clinging to dignity in old fabric, or a woman too poor to buy new. And whichever choice I made, I walked out already heavy with judgment. The neighbor, of course, continued as if nothing had happened. She knocked on my door one afternoon, smiling sweetly, asking if she could borrow sugar for a cake. I gave it to her because I always had, but I noticed that my hand shook when I wrote her name in the ledger again. It was not the tremor of age. It was the tremor of someone who knows she has crossed a line inside herself. I had begun keeping score, and once you begin, the game is already changing. The escalation was quiet, almost invisible, but I could feel it pressing in from every side. My world was becoming smaller. I no longer lingered at the market. I no longer stopped to greet acquaintances. I no longer sat in the park after errands. I hurried home, shut the door, and sat in my rooms like someone hiding from a storm. And yet the storm was not outside. It was inside. A slow gathering of clouds in my chest, waiting for the moment they would finally break. I knew that something had to shift, because if it did not, I would shrink until I disappeared entirely. So I began, almost without realizing, to resist in small ways. I pinned an old brooch to the coat one morning before going out, a piece of costume jewelry from decades ago that sparkled faintly in the sun, and I walked slower through the market, daring myself to be seen. No one commented, no one praised, but I felt the difference in my own spine. It was not yet defiance, not yet courage, but it was the first flicker of both. And when my neighbor came again the following week for flour, I gave it silently, but afterward. Instead of only recording her name, I began a new list on a separate page. A list titled, "What is Mine?" At first, it contained only the smallest things: the teacup with a crack that fit my finger, the lamp with its yellow shade, the worn leather of my chair. But writing it made me realize that even in the midst of humiliation, I still had ownership of pieces of my life, however modest. And perhaps, if I could hold on to that list, I could hold on to myself. The first escalation, then, was not dramatic. No shouting, no confrontation. Only a slow erosion of dignity, countered by the slow emergence of something else, something not yet defined, but alive. The insult had planted itself in me, and like a seed it was sending roots through every corner of my days. Whether it would grow into poison or into strength, I did not yet know, but I could feel it shaping me, and once shaping begins, there is no going back. I cannot say exactly when the shift began, only that one morning I woke, and the heaviness that had been pressing on my chest for weeks felt different, not gone, not lighter, but sharper, like a blade instead of a stone. And I understood that I could either let it keep cutting into me until I was nothing, or I could learn to hold it in my own hand. That realization startled me, because I had grown so accustomed to enduring, to bending, to waiting for storms to pass, that I had almost forgotten what it meant to act on my own behalf. Yet as I sat at my small kitchen table drinking tea that had long lost its flavor, staring at the ledger with my neighbor's debts and my own list of what still belonged to me, I felt something stir, a whisper that said enough, a whisper that said I was allowed to move differently now. The first act was small and would have seemed meaningless to anyone else. I opened the drawer where my lipstick had been sitting untouched for years, the same deep red I used to wear when my husband and I would walk to the dance hall on Saturday nights. And I applied it carefully, hands trembling not from age but from the memory of who I had been when I last wore it. My reflection in the cracked mirror looked both strange and familiar, like meeting an old friend after decades apart. That day, I pinned the brooch again to my coat, buttoned it tight, and walked to the market, not with speed to escape, but with a deliberate pace that dared others to look. And they did look. Some frowned, some smirked, but I felt taller, straighter, not because their gaze changed, but because mine had. When my neighbor hissed at me again, asking at my door for sugar with that same sweet tone that always carried contempt beneath it, I gave it as usual, but this time without words, without the false smile that tried to smooth over the insult. And when I sat back down at my table, I wrote her name again in the ledger, but beside it I added something new: the date, the exact time, as if by recording it precisely, I was transforming it from a humiliation into evidence, evidence of who was truly begging in this story. Writing it gave me a strange satisfaction, not revenge exactly, but control. And after so many weeks of feeling powerless, that control was intoxicating. The change did not happen all at once, but I began to test myself in small ways. Instead of buying only bruised fruit, I asked the vendor for the firmest apples and held his gaze until he gave them without argument. Instead of rushing to sit at the back of the bus, I chose a seat near the front and let my bag rest firmly beside me, claiming space I had long since taught myself to yield. At home, I opened the old chest at the foot of my bed and took out letters from decades past, photographs of myself when my hair was still black and my smile still wide, and I placed one on the nightstand where I could see it each morning. A reminder that I had been vibrant once and could still be something other than invisible now. The most unexpected change was in my silence. Where once it had been the silence of resignation, now it began to feel like the silence of choice. When my neighbor knocked, when clerks spoke too loudly, when strangers on the street looked through me, I did not rush to explain myself or soften the moment. I let silence stretch, heavy and deliberate. And in that silence, I felt stronger, as though I was finally teaching them that I was not here to be handled or pitied, but to be acknowledged on my own terms. It was on a gray afternoon, clouds low and air damp with the promise of rain, that I understood how far I had come from the day of the insult. I was walking through the market again, coat buttoned, lipstick on, carrying only a small bag of potatoes and onions because that was all I needed, when I saw her standing by the bread stall with another neighbor, laughing too loudly, the kind of laugh meant to be overheard. I braced myself, but instead of shrinking, I slowed my steps, passed close enough that they had to stop their words, and I met her eyes. For the first time, she looked away first. It was a tiny victory, so small it might not even be noticed by anyone else. But to me, it was monumental. It was proof that I was no longer the woman who rushed home with her chin low. It was proof that something inside me had shifted from endurance to resistance. That night, I sat again with the ledger and the list of what was mine. I added to it not just objects, but qualities, my patience, my memory, my stubbornness. I realized that these too were mine and could not be stolen by gossip or diminished by stares. The act of writing them down steadied me, like laying bricks to rebuild a wall. It is not that I suddenly became fearless. Age does not erase fear. It only teaches you to live with it. I still felt the sting of whispers. I still dreaded the day rent would rise beyond what I could pay. I still woke in the night with my heart pounding from dreams of being forgotten. But alongside the fear, something else grew, a small flame of defiance that would not go out. And I tended that flame carefully, knowing it was fragile, but also knowing it was mine. Looking back, I see that the shift was not dramatic in the way stories often tell it. There was no grand confrontation, no speech that silenced the crowd. It was quieter, subtler, but perhaps more powerful for that. It was the decision, repeated in small acts, to stop collapsing in on myself and to begin expanding again, however slightly, into the space I had always deserved. It was the decision to wear lipstick, to claim the good apples, to write my neighbor's name as evidence rather than injury. It was the decision to stop waiting for others to give me dignity and to begin giving it to myself. That is what the shift felt like. Not triumph, but return. A slow reclaiming of pieces I had scattered over the years to make room for everyone else. I gathered them now, not to display, but to carry within me. And though I did not yet know where this path would lead, I knew at last that I had begun to walk it. It is one thing to whisper change to yourself in the quiet of your own kitchen, to apply lipstick before the mirror and feel a private defiance. But it is another thing entirely to carry that change into the open air where the world is waiting to test you. And that test came sooner than I expected, pressing against me with the weight of both the past and the present, until I could no longer pretend that I was only experimenting with small acts of courage. The escalation began not with a shout, but with a letter. A simple folded envelope slipped under my door one morning, the handwriting on it unmistakably belonging to my oldest grandchild, the one who used to visit me without being asked, who once spent an afternoon painting a birdhouse red and said it would be the brightest corner in the yard. The letter was short, only a few lines, but each word carried more weight than the grocery bags I struggled to lift. He wrote that he missed me, that his parents, my own son and his wife, were worried because I had grown so quiet, that they thought perhaps something was wrong. He asked me to call. His words were kind, not accusatory, but they pulled at me because they reminded me of the bonds I once believed unbreakable, bonds now frayed by distance and silence. I read that letter twice, then 3 times, and folded it carefully into my ledger. It softened something inside me, yet it also sharpened my sense of what was at stake. For even as my grandson reached out with genuine warmth, I could hear the echo of my son's clipped tone, the way he once told me not to mention my arthritis at the dinner table, because it made the conversation heavy, the way his wife rolled her eyes. When I brought my own snacks on family outings, the way they made decisions about my life as though I were a child needing direction, rather than a woman who had built the very ground they stood on. The letter was a reminder that love still flickered somewhere, but also that love could be used as bait to draw me back into roles that suffocated me. Not long after that letter, the neighbor struck again. I should have expected it, for people like her do not know how to stop once they have tasted the power of humiliation. She caught me at the market once more, near the stall that sells fresh herbs, and she said in a voice loud enough for others to hear that I must be buying parsley to mask the smell of poverty in my cooking. This time, I did not smile. I did not hurry away. I turned and said clearly, so that the others could hear, that she owed me 3 cups of sugar, 2 sticks of butter, and 1 full bag of flour, all borrowed without thanks. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling. For a moment, silence. Then a few of the women nearby laughed nervously, not at me, but at the shock of seeing someone like her exposed. My neighbor's face flushed, and she muttered something about generosity. But the damage was done. For the first time, I had spoken aloud what I had only written in my ledger, and I felt taller for it. But triumph is always followed by retaliation. That evening, she knocked at my door, her smile tight, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She said she did not understand why I had humiliated her in public, that neighbors ought to support one another, that she had only been joking. I listened without speaking, and when she finally asked if she might borrow coffee because her cupboard was empty, I said nothing, simply closed the door. It was the gentlest of refusals, but it left me trembling because for decades I had always given, always yielded. That night, I could not sleep, pacing my small apartment, hearing her words again. But underneath the tremor was also a new steadiness, the knowledge that closing a door was not cruelty, but boundary, and boundaries are the soil where dignity grows. The escalation did not stop there. My family, alerted perhaps by my grandson's worry, began to press closer in ways that felt less like concern and more like surveillance. One afternoon the telephone rang, a rarity in itself, and when I lifted the receiver, it was my daughter-in-law's voice, syrupy and strained. She said she had heard that I seemed withdrawn, that I should come to stay with them for a while, that it would be simpler if I were closer to family. Simpler? That word again, the same word she once used at the airport years ago when she suggested I wait in the lounge while they checked the bags. The word that always meant my presence was inconvenient, that it was easier for them if I were set aside. I told her my life was not meant to be simpler for others, and I hung up before she could reply. My hand shook afterward, but my heart did not. Then came the letter from my son, longer than my grandson's, written in neat, angry script. He said he could not believe I had embarrassed the family by airing grievances in public, that the neighbor had told him I was becoming erratic, that perhaps I was not well. He accused me of being ungrateful, of turning small slights into melodrama, of refusing the support he offered. The words bled anger and control, and at the end, he wrote that he was willing to talk if I was ready to be reasonable. That word sliced through me more than any insult from the market, because it revealed what he truly thought of me. Not a mother. Not a woman, but a problem to be managed, a nuisance to be corrected. I folded that letter once, then again, and slid it into the envelope with my grandson's gentle words. Side by side, they looked like the two paths I might take. One toward surrender, one toward self. And in that moment, I knew the test had arrived. The pressure mounted in the days that followed. The neighbor glared at me openly in the market. Other women whispered behind my back, some in sympathy, some in scorn. My landlord delivered another notice about rising costs, as if the walls themselves conspired to push me out. My family sent messages through others, a cousin stopping me on the street to say they were worried, a letter from a lawyer suggesting I consider moving closer to care. Care, as though I had not cared for them all my life, as though I had not kept them alive with the very hands they now dismissed. I felt the weight of all of it pressing on me, and for a moment I wondered if they would succeed in pulling me back into silence, into obedience, into invisibility. But then I remembered the moment at the herb stall, the hush after my words, the look on my neighbor's face when her debts were spoken aloud. I remembered the lipstick in the mirror, the brooch on my coat, the list of what was mine. And I realized that the escalation was not only theirs, it was mine as well. Every time they pushed harder, I pushed back. Not with violence, but with presence. Not with rage, but with refusal. The second escalation was not a single event, but a gathering storm. The neighbors' continued insults, the family's attempts at control, the market's whispers, the letters that accused and manipulated. Each was a wave, and together they tried to drown me. But I stood, sometimes trembling, sometimes weary, but always standing. I began to walk through the market with slower steps, not hurrying past the stairs. I began to refuse the worst fruit, to demand fair cuts of meat, to insist on being addressed with respect. Small things, perhaps, but each one a stone in the wall I was building around my dignity. At night, when sleep evaded me, I sat by the window and wrote in the ledger. Not only the debts of my neighbor now, but also the words of my family, recorded like accounts to be balanced. Each insult, each dismissal, each attempt to erase me, I wrote it down, and beside it, I wrote what was still mine, my endurance, my voice, my choice. The ledger grew thick with entries, but instead of crushing me, it steadied me, because I could see the truth in ink, that I had given more than I had ever taken, that I was not the beggar in anyone's story, that I was the foundation on which they all had stood, and they had mistaken that foundation for weakness. And so, when the neighbor appeared again, this time in the bakery below my flat, speaking loudly about how sad it was to see someone decline so obviously, I did not shrink. I walked past her, head high, coat buttoned, and I said in a voice that carried across the room, "Decline is what happens when you borrow from others and give nothing back." The baker turned his head. The customers looked up, and she flushed once more. That moment was not victory in the grand sense, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that I was still here, still capable of claiming my own space, still unwilling to vanish quietly. The second escalation, then, was not meant to break me, though it tried. It was meant to test me, to see if I would retreat into silence or rise into visibility. And though I shook, though I lay awake at night with doubts crawling across my chest, I chose to rise. Slowly, awkwardly, defiantly, I rose. It is a strange thing to sense the exact moment when patience finally snaps, not with a violent gesture, not with a scream, but with a clarity so sharp it feels like glass breaking inside you. And I knew that moment had come when I stood in front of the mirror one cold morning and saw myself in the coat that had been both shield and shackle. And I realized I could no longer carry it without being swallowed whole by what it represented. The decision came suddenly, but also as if it had been growing in me for months, watered by every insult, every whisper, every letter that tried to fold me back into obedience. And that morning I did not argue with myself. I did not hesitate. I simply unhooked the coat from its place, folded it carefully over my arm, and walked out the door as if I were carrying a body to burial. The air was crisp, sharp enough to sting my cheeks, but I did not shiver, though beneath the coat I wore only a thin sweater. I walked to the second-hand shop 3 streets away, a place I had passed many times but never entered, a place where other people's discarded lives hung from racks and waited to be chosen again. The shop smelled of mothballs and dust, of fabric gone stale from neglect, but to me it smelled like possibility. I laid the coat on the counter in front of the woman who worked there, and she ran her hands across the worn fabric with a look that was not pity but appraisal. She said it was still good wool, still warm, still useful. I nodded and said it had carried me through 40 years, that it had carried more than I could ever explain. She asked if I wanted to sell it or trade it, and without hesitation I said trade. She led me to the rack where winter coats hung heavy and silent, each one with a story I did not know, each one waiting for someone to claim it. My hand landed on a dark gray wool coat, plain but sturdy, its lining intact, its buttons firm. It was not new, not elegant, but it was whole. And when I tried it on, it felt as though it belonged to me, not as memory, but as present. I returned to the counter, and the woman nodded, saying the exchange was fair. She folded my old coat, placed it gently in a box, and wrote a receipt for the difference. A few coins she pressed into my hand. I held them tightly, not because of their value, but because of what they represented. That I had chosen myself, that I had traded burden for renewal, that I had buried a relic and clothed myself in something that belonged to now. Walking home in that new coat, I felt the weight differently. It was not history pressing on my shoulders, but fabric protecting me from the cold. I passed the market and deliberately slowed, letting the vendors see me. Some looked puzzled, some looked away, but I walked taller. Not because the coat was finer, it was not, but because it was mine by choice, not by inheritance of struggle. The whispers felt distant, powerless. That evening, as though fate had timed it to test me, my neighbor knocked at my door again. I opened it a crack, enough to see her face, the same false smile stretched across it. She said she needed sugar, that she was baking for her grandchildren. Her voice carried no shame, no acknowledgement of debts, only expectation, as though all the years of taking had created a right. I looked at her for a long time, long enough for her smile to falter, and then I said calmly, "No, not today, not anymore." And I closed the door. No anger, no explanation, just finality. The silence after that click of the latch was louder than any argument I had ever endured. I leaned against the door, trembling, because in that refusal was everything. Every bruise of humiliation, every dismissal, every erasure. And for the first time, I had answered not with endurance, but with denial. I thought I might feel guilt, that familiar ache of having disappointed someone. But what I felt instead was a deep stillness, a steadiness that filled me from the inside. I had said no, and the world had not ended. Later that night, I hung the new coat on the hook where the old one had always rested, and I looked at it as if it were a flag planted in the soil of my own life. The hook seemed lighter, the wall brighter, my apartment less suffocating. I took the ledger from the cupboard and opened it to the last page where I had written, "What is mine?" I added a line. My refusal. My choice. My voice. Then I closed it with a firmness that felt like closing a chapter. The climax was not a shout in the market, not a fight with my family, not a dramatic confrontation with the neighbor. It was the trade of one coat for another, the closing of one door, the choosing of myself over expectation. It was irreversible, because once you taste the steadiness that comes from refusal, you cannot go back to giving until you vanish. Once you walk through the street in a coat you chose for yourself, you cannot return to carrying the burden of one that was only survival. And so, as I sat by the window that night, the streetlights flickering below, the bakery shuttered and silent, I felt not triumphant, but whole, as if the fragments I had been gathering in small acts had finally come together into something unbroken. I thought of my husband, of the winters we endured, of the laughter that had once filled these rooms, and I whispered to the dark, "I am still here." And for the first time in many years, the words did not feel like a plea, but like a declaration. In the days that followed, the world looked the same, but I carried it differently, as though the air itself had shifted around me, though in truth it was I who had changed. I still woke to the smell of yeast from the bakery below. I still heard the pipes groan when I turned the tap. I still counted coins carefully at the market, but each task no longer pressed me down with the same weight, because beneath every gesture there was the memory of that door closing and that coat folded into a box. That refusal, simple as it was, had cut a line through my life, and on one side was the woman who endured until she nearly disappeared, and on the other was the woman who chose to remain visible to herself. The neighbor still walks the market, still gossips with the same shrill tone. But when she passes me now, there is a pause, a small hesitation in her voice, and though she does not apologize, women like her rarely do, I see in her eyes the recognition that I am no longer her target. She has turned her whispers toward others, perhaps easier prey, and though part of me aches to know the cruelty continues, another part accepts that it is not my burden anymore. I have laid it down, and laying it down is the greatest mercy I could have given myself. My family, too, circles around with their concerns dressed as kindness, their letters filled with advice and veiled instructions. But I answer them differently now. I do not argue or defend. I do not explain the small choices of my days. I simply state what I will and will not do. When my son writes that it would be better for me to move into a room closer to them, I write back that I already live where I belong. When my daughter-in-law calls and asks whether I am lonely, I answer that solitude is not loneliness when you fill it with your own voice. At first, there is silence on their end, surprised that I no longer bend so easily, but even they have begun to adjust. They still see me as old, perhaps fragile, but they see also that I will not be erased. The market has become again a place I can bear, sometimes even enjoy. I walk slower now, not because of shame, but because I choose to notice the smells of fruit, the brightness of the fish laid on ice, the laughter of children tugging at their mother's skirts. Some vendors have begun greeting me by name again, perhaps because they sense that I demand it, or perhaps because people always respect what they cannot diminish. It does not matter which. What matters is that I am no longer invisible, at least not to myself. In the evenings, I still sit with the ledger, but I no longer write only debts or insults. I write small victories. The day I chose the firmest apples without guilt. The time I walked past my neighbor without lowering my eyes. The warmth of my new coat when the wind pressed cold against my face. The ledger has become less a record of wounds and more a testament of survival, a book not of erasure, but of return. And sometimes, when the night is very quiet and the city settles into its own sleep, I think of the women who will come after me, the ones who will be called names in markets or dismissed in their families, the ones who will be told they are too old, too poor, too invisible to matter. I wish I could press into their hands the lesson I nearly lost, that dignity is not given, it is claimed, that silence is not always virtue. Sometimes it is the rope that tightens around your own throat, that the smallest refusal, the gentlest closing of a door, can open a world inside yourself. I am 76. I live above a bakery whose walls breathe with the rhythms of ovens and shutters. I wear a coat that is not new but chosen, and that makes all the difference. They once called me a beggar, but I was never the one who begged. I gave and I gave until the giving erased me. Now I give to myself first. That is the truth I carry as I walk through these streets, no longer hidden, no longer bowed. And if another woman hears my story, if she recognizes herself in my words, then let her know this. You do not need to wait for permission to be seen again. You need only to begin, even if all you can manage at first is to say no at your own door. That too is enough to change everything.